Imagine holding the oldest, most complete known copies of the Gospel of Mark. You carefully turn the ancient parchment to the resurrection, which is, arguably the most explosive and consequential event claimed in human history. And you find nothing. The story just stops.
Right. It just abruptly ends.
It totally ends. The ending is completely missing. Welcome, everyone, to today's deep dive. Before we unravel this massive 2,000-year-old mystery, I really want to offer a warm welcome to you, our listener, and offer a divine blessing for your day and for your entire week ahead. May you find clarity, peace, and inspiration in whatever you're tackling right now.
I love that. And it is so great to be here for this. We really have a genuinely fascinating journey ahead of us today.
We really do, because when we look back at antiquity, there is often this assumption that everything is just lost to the sands of time. Like we're dealing with these murky legends that sort of just grew in the dark over centuries.
Yeah, exactly, like an ancient game of telephone.
Right, exactly. But then you step into the world of biblical scholarship, specifically looking at the historical claims surrounding the resurrection of Jesus, and that murky landscape gets hit with a massive spotlight.
It really does. The textual and historical landscape here is incredibly complex. It's heavily scrutinized and honestly absolutely riveting.
Totally. And to guide us through this today, we are zeroing in on Mark chapter 16. We're pulling extensive notes from both the Holman and the NAA Study Bibles, which offer some just incredible textual insights.
And we are pairing those notes with a deeply analytical historical essay by the scholar Gary R. Habermas. Our mission today is to explore that exact intersection.
Right, the intersection of ancient texts and hard historical timelines.
Exactly, and the profound questions they raise. But to really grasp the weight of this, we have to start by setting the scene properly. Mark chapter 16 begins at a very specific, almost mundane moment in time. The Sabbath has just ended.
Okay, so the sun has officially set on Saturday.
That's the key. Under Jewish law, they couldn't do any kind of labor or commerce during the Sabbath. They were strictly required to wait.
Yeah, they had to wait until sundown.
Right, once the sun goes down, that finally allows Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome to go out to the local markets.
To purchase aromatic spices.
Exactly. They buy these spices Saturday evening, and then they arrive at the tomb very early on Sunday morning, right as the sun is rising over Jerusalem.
So we are at the tomb, and what these women find there actually serves as one of the strongest pieces of historical evidence for modern scholars. But before we get to the historical evidence, I have a really specific, almost mechanical question for you.
Oh, okay, let's hear it.
According to Christian theology, Jesus had a resurrected, glorified body. The texts later say he could, appear in locked rooms. He wasn't bound by normal physical constraints.
Right, he could just appear.
Yeah. So if we operate under the assumption of that theology, why did the massive stone covering the tomb need to be rolled away at all? Like, why bother moving it?
That is such a good question. What's fascinating here is that the Holman Study Bible notes address this exact tension. And the answer is surprisingly practical.
Practical how?
Well, the stone wasn't removed so that Jesus could get out. The text actually implies it was removed so that the witnesses could get in.
Oh, wow. So they could actually see the empty space.
Yes. The text tells us the women arrive to see that this massive stone is already rolled back. They tentatively enter the tomb, and instead of a body, they find a young man sitting on the right side.
Dressed in a white robe, right, which the study notes clarify is an angel.
Yeah, and his very first words to them are, "Do not be afraid," which is essentially the standard, mandatory biblical greeting for an angelic encounter.
Because they're terrifying.
Exactly. Interacting with the divine in these ancient texts is almost never presented as a warm, fuzzy moment. It is a terrifying, overwhelming, and deeply alien experience for a human being.
I mean, they are literally trembling. But then the angel says something else. He tells them Jesus has risen. He points to the empty place where the body was laid, and then he gives them a directive.
A very specific directive, yeah.
And this is a detail that just always gets me. The angel says, "But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee." Why single out Peter from the rest of the group? Like, why name him specifically?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the gospel narratives, that specific mention of Peter carries immense emotional weight. The Holman notes point out that this is a deliberate, targeted encouragement.
Because of the denial.
Right. Remember the context. Just a few days prior, during the darkest, most chaotic hours of the trial and crucifixion, Peter had publicly, repeatedly, and painfully denied even knowing Jesus.
So he's probably sitting in hiding somewhere, just consumed by guilt and shame.
He likely believes he has completely failed and permanently severed his relationship with his teacher. So the angel specifically naming Peter is a message of restoration. It's communicating, you are still included. Your failure wasn't final.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because while that is a beautiful narrative detail, I want to pivot from the emotional impact to the hard historical analysis.
Getting into the Habermas essay.
Yes, exactly. This brings us to Gary R. Habermas's essay. Habermas talks about the tools that modern critical historians use to determine if an ancient text is reliable. And one of the most powerful tools in their toolkit is something called the criterion of embarrassment.
This is a crucial concept in historical and textual studies. It really is.
Let me try an analogy here to see if I'm understanding this right. It's like setting up an alibi in a criminal trial.
Okay, I like where this is going.
If you and I are going to make up a completely fake story to convince a jury of our innocence, we are going to use the most airtight, culturally accepted, perfectly logical details possible. We are going to design the story to be absolutely bulletproof.
You wouldn't leave any holes.
Right. What we are not going to do is intentionally use details that make us look foolish or make our case legally weaker in the eyes of the judge.
That legal framing is exactly how historians view ancient text construction. And this raises an important question, right? How does that apply to the empty tomb?
Yeah, what's the connection?
Well, in first-century Greco-Roman and Jewish cultures, the legal reality was that the testimony of women was highly marginalized.
Marginalized how, exactly? Like socially or legally?
In terms of actual legal standing, public courts and official testimony were the domain of free, property-owning men. The Holman Notes explicitly state that mainstream Judaism at that time generally did not accept the testimony of women as legally valid.
Wow.
Yeah, it wasn't sufficient in a formal court of law unless there were very specific, rare exceptions. Their words simply didn't carry the legal weight required to establish a contested fact.
So they couldn't even be primary legal witnesses. That's wild.
They couldn't. So put yourself in the shoes of a first-century conspirator trying to invent a fake resurrection story to convince a highly skeptical Jewish and Roman world.
You would never use women as your primary source.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the early Christians were fabricating this event to launch a new religion, they would have written that prominent, respected, culturally validated men were the first to discover the empty tomb. Like Peter or John, or maybe a sympathetic member of the Sanhedrin.
Because that's the only way the story would have had any PR value. It would have sold the narrative to the public.
Instead, all four Gospels awkwardly admit that the primary foundational witnesses to the single most important event in their religion were women. It was culturally embarrassing.
It really was.
It was an apologetic nightmare for them in the first century. And we know early critics of Christianity mocked them for this exact reason. To historians, that serves as a massive flashing neon sign.
It strongly indicates that the authors weren't inventing a convenient, market-tested narrative. They were simply reporting what they believed actually happened, no matter how legally or culturally inconvenient it was to their cause.
They included it because they were stuck with the facts as they knew them.
Wow. Okay, so the women received this message, and according to Mark chapter 16, verse 8, they flee from the tomb. They are trembling, they are bewildered, and the text says they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And that is where the Gospel of Mark gets incredibly mysterious.
Oh, yeah. It is arguably one of the most famous textual puzzles in the entire New Testament.
Because if you look at both the Holman and the NAA Study Bibles, verses 9 through 20 of Mark 16 have these massive textual brackets around them, or they have extensive footnotes flagging them. What is actually happening with these verses?
Right, let's put on our textual detective hats for a moment. When biblical scholars translate the New Testament, they don't just look at one old book. They compare thousands of ancient Greek manuscripts.
They're looking at the whole available record.
Exactly. And what they found is that the oldest and most historically reliable Greek manuscripts we possess, specifically the famous 4th century ones known as the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, they do not contain verses 9 through 20.
Wait, really? They just aren't there.
They are completely absent. The Gospel of Mark in those ancient copies literally ends at verse 8. The women run away in fear, and the page is done.
Just a hard stop. But wait, if those early copies stop at verse 8, where did verses 9 through 20 come from? Because the transition there is so jarring.
It's incredibly jarring.
Yeah, if you read it, verse 9 suddenly reintroduces Mary Magdalene. It says, from whom he had driven out 7 demons. But we already know her. Mark just talked about her in verse 1 of the same chapter. Why introduce her again?
You're hitting on exactly what textual critics look for. The narrative scene is incredibly clunky. The notes in the NAA Study Bible point out that it's not just an abrupt story transition. The actual mechanics of the language change.
Mechanics of the language, what do you mean?
Well, the Greek vocabulary and the writing style shift significantly in these final verses compared to the rest of Mark's gospel.
How so? Can you give an example of what they're looking at?
Sure. Mark has a very specific, almost breathless way of writing. He uses the Greek word for immediately, constantly. But in verses 9 through 20, the author uses entirely different Greek connecting words that Mark never uses anywhere else in his entire gospel.
Oh, wow.
It would be like reading a fast-paced thriller by a modern author, and suddenly the final chapter is written in the dense, poetic style of Shakespeare. It strongly indicates a different author stepped in.
So I have to ask the obvious question here. Did someone just hack the Bible? Like, did some rogue scribe just invent an ending to tie up loose ends?
It's not quite that conspiratorial.
Yeah.
The NAA notes give us some great historical context to ground this. It's true that some early church fathers, like Eusebius and Jerome in the 300s and 400s, openly noted that these verses were missing from almost all the reliable Greek copies they had in their day.
Okay, so it was a known issue back then.
Yes, but however, other early figures, like Irenaeus in the late 100s, actually quoted from these verses.
Okay, so this longer ending is still very ancient, even though it wasn't original to Mark.
Very ancient. The general consensus among modern scholars is that these verses were likely added by someone else in the early church, perhaps to replace an original ending that was lost, or simply to provide closure. But they weren't making things up out of thin air.
What were they pulling from then?
If you read verses 9 through 20, they essentially function as a rapid-fire summary of the resurrection appearances that are already documented in the other Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John. It was an attempt to give Mark a more complete ending based on the accepted oral and written traditions of the early church.
That makes a lot of sense. But we have to talk about the wildest part of this long ending.
Oh boy, here we go.
Because in verses 17 and 18, it lists these signs that will accompany believers. And it explicitly says they will pick up serpents with their hands, and if they drink any deadly poison, it will not harm them. What on earth do we do with that?
It definitely sounds extreme to our modern ears, and unfortunately it has been heavily misused. But again, the NAA study notes provide essential grounding. We have to read this in the context of the early Christian mission, not as a bizarre party trick or a test of faith.
So I shouldn't go testing this out in my backyard to see if I'm a true believer.
Definitely not. The notes clarify that this is absolutely not a command to test God by purposely drinking poison or seeking out venomous snakes. The biblical narrative constantly warns against testing God.
Right.
Rather, this was understood as a promise of divine protection for the apostles as they went out into a fiercely hostile world to spread their message.
Do we have an example of that actually happening in the texts, or is it just metaphorical?
We have a very literal example. The notes specifically point to the book of Acts, chapter 28. The apostle Paul is shipwrecked on the island of Malta. He's gathering brushwood for a fire, and a venomous snake comes out of the heat and bites him, fastening onto his hand. The local people expect him to swell up and suddenly drop dead. But Paul simply shakes the snake off into the fire and suffers absolutely no harm.
Oh, right. So the early church reading Mark 16 would say, yes, look at Paul in Acts 28. That's exactly what this means. It's about supernatural protection during the mission, not a circus act.
Exactly. It's describing the unique confirmation of the apostolic message in that specific first-century context.
Okay, so if Mark's original manuscript actually stops at verse 8 with terrified, silent women, how did anyone ever find out?
Right, that's the big question.
If they stayed silent, how did this message explode across the Roman Empire so fast? Which brings us to Gary Habermas again, because the historical development here is stunning.
Here is where we get into the really rigorous historical timelines. People today often assume the Gospels were written many decades after the events, and that this massive gap gave plenty of time for legends to grow and evolve.
Right, the idea that a story about a cool teacher slowly morphed into a story about a resurrected God over 100 years.
But Habermas presents what he calls the ultimate test case for the resurrection. He points out that long before the Gospels were even written down, there were primitive Christian traditions, creeds, and hymns circulating orally.
Let's talk about that oral tradition for a second, because in our culture, oral tradition sounds like that telephone game we played in kindergarten. You whisper a sentence, and by the end of the circle, it's completely different. How can historians trust an oral tradition?
That is a fundamental difference between modern Western culture and ancient Jewish culture.
Hmm.
Ancient Jewish religious life was heavily built around oral tradition. It wasn't casual whispering.
It was more structured.
Much more structured. It was a rigorous community practice of memorizing large blocks of text, often using specific rhythms or poetic structures to ensure the exact words were passed down flawlessly.
So it was more like memorizing a famous song lyric today. If someone sings the wrong word, the whole crowd knows it and corrects them.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it. When we look at the New Testament letters, particularly the letters of Paul, scholars have identified embedded fragments of these highly structured early traditions. Habermas mentions a primitive Christian hymn found in Philippians chapter 2.
Okay.
But the most crucial one, the absolute centerpiece for historical scholars, is found in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7.
The 1 Corinthians 15 creed. Let's look at the timeline on this because this completely reframes the legend theory.
The timeline forces even the most skeptical critical scholars to sit up and take notice. Almost universally, across the theological spectrum, scholars agree that this specific creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is the earliest known tradition about the resurrection.
Wow.
And Paul explicitly states in the text that he received this tradition and is simply passing it on.
And Habermas maps out exactly when Paul received it. Paul says he received this directly from the original eyewitnesses, specifically Peter and James, who was Jesus' brother. And he got this from them during a visit to Jerusalem around the year 35 AD.
Let's pause and really emphasize that date. The crucifixion of Jesus is generally dated by historians to around 30 AD.
Right.
That means Paul is receiving a highly formalized, structured creed about the resurrection of Jesus just 5 or 6 years after the event itself.
That is blink of an eye timing in the ancient world. I mean, this is like a journalist interviewing the primary subjects while the event is still trending on the front page of the news.
And the historian Richard Bauckham, whom Habermas references, stresses this exact point in his work on eyewitnesses. We're not dealing with anonymous folklore developing in the shadows over a century.
No.
We are dealing with a continuous chain of named, identifiable eyewitnesses who are actively leading the early church.
And Paul didn't just check in once and disappear. Habermas notes that 14 years after that first visit, Paul went back to Jerusalem. He sat down with Peter, James, and John again to compare notes, essentially saying, here's the gospel I am preaching out in the world, and their message remained completely identical.
Which leads to Habermas's final historical argument regarding these eyewitnesses, the argument of martyrdom.
Okay, I want to push back on this point pretty hard because I hear this a lot. People point out that in modern times, people die for their religious or political beliefs all the time.
Sure, it happens frequently.
Right. Look at Jim Jones or Heaven's Gate or any extremist political group. Cult leaders and followers willingly die for absolute lies today. How is Peter or James dying any different from someone in a modern fringe group giving their life for a cause? Dying for a belief doesn't make the belief historically true.
That is a very valid critique, and it's one historians grapple with. But Habermas clarifies a vital epistemological distinction here.
Okay, what's the distinction?
It is completely true that people will willingly die for a lie if they sincerely believe it to be true. They are dying for a delusion, but their internal conviction is genuine.
Right, they think they're right.
Exactly. However, the original disciples, Peter, James, John, the women, they were in a completely unique position compared to a modern cult follower.
Because of their proximity to the event?
Yes, a modern follower is trusting something someone else told them. But these original disciples didn't just believe a teaching passed down to them. They were the ones claiming to have physically seen, spoken with, and eaten with the resurrected Jesus.
Ah, I see the difference.
Therefore, they actually knew with absolute certainty whether they were telling the truth or whether they had fabricated the whole thing themselves.
If it was a lie they themselves invented in a back room somewhere.
And human psychology and history tell us that while someone might die for a false belief they think is true, no one willingly chooses to endure Roman torture, imprisonment, and brutal execution for a claim they personally know they fabricated.
They would have cracked. When the Romans or the religious authorities threatened them with execution, at least one of them would have broken rank and said, okay, we made it up, the body is hidden over there, just let me go.
But our historical records show that none of them did. Now, Their willingness to face death rather than recant their testimony doesn't automatically prove the resurrection happened. A historian can't prove a miracle, but to a historian, it is the ultimate, undeniable proof of their total sincerity. They genuinely, deeply believed they had seen the risen Christ.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? What Habermas concludes from all this is that engaging with ancient texts doesn't require turning off your brain.
Not at all.
His analysis, alongside the deep textual work of the study Bibles, suggests that you can look at the footnotes. You can look at the cultural context of female testimony in first-century courts. You can trace the rigorous historical timelines of oral traditions in 1 Corinthians 15, and believers can still find a robust foundation that stands up to critical scrutiny.
It's an invitation to dig deeper, not to look away.
Mm-hmm.
And I really want to leave you with one final thought to ponder, bringing us all the way back to that textual mystery. Think about Mark's abrupt ending.
Right, the missing ending at verse 8.
We spent a lot of time talking about how it abruptly stops, with the women running away in silence. But consider this. In ancient Greek storytelling and drama, this technique of an unresolved ending was sometimes used deliberately.
Oh, really? Like an open-ended movie?
Exactly. It was designed to force the audience to become the jury. If Mark originally stopped the narrative right there, without wrapping it up in a neat bow, he is using a brilliant literary device.
Wow.
He doesn't give you the resolution because historically the early church believed you are the resolution. The story is handed off. Mark's pen stops moving so yours can begin. The tomb is empty. What are you going to do about it?
The stone wasn't rolled away for him. It was rolled away for us to look inside. What an incredible place to leave it. Thank you so much for exploring this deep dive with us today. It has been an absolute privilege. And as we close, we want to say goodbye by reminding you that God blesses all the listeners. Keep diving deep.